Welcome back to another YouTube video, and what we're going to be talking about today is understanding tone, part 2. Alright, so here we go. We are going to finish out our little thing on tone that we're doing, and as you can see, I decided to wear the ugliest shirt that I could possibly find in my closet today. This thing is hideous, and honestly, I don't even remember buying this shirt. I moved. If you've seen some earlier videos, you've noticed that my surroundings have changed. I moved between states. I moved back home, and in my my trials and tribulations as a very young old man, I packing up all my clothes and stuff, and I found this hideously blue and gray and I don't know what color blue that is, and yellow striped shirt. Apparently at one point in my life I attended a special school and I wore this shirt. So I figured I'd pull it out and wear it today for all of you guys. But on that note, here we go. We're going to talk about tone and we're going to finish this thing out. Now, we talked about guitars and pickups and tone woods last time. This time we're going to talk about not so much heads, we're going to talk about tubes, because tubes ultimately are what, obviously there's a lot that shapes the sound inside of a head, but if you get a Marshall, it's going to have Marshall wiring in it. You get a Mesa, it's going to have Mesa wiring in it. But we're going to talk about tubes, and we're going to talk a little bit about wood for cabinets. We're not going to talk a lot about speakers, however, because speakers, there's simply hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of speakers, and you can spend the rest of your life. Can you all hear that? The crickets. Where I moved to, these things are insanely loud. This reminds me of being in Florida. Around dusk is when I'm shooting this, around dusk time. The crickets in Florida, they're so loud. You can't hear anything. It's amazing how loud they are. And where I'm at here now, I moved back to Tennessee. They're unbelievably loud where I moved to. So I'm going to have to get me a little, I would say pellet gun and go cricket hunting, but kind of hard to find crickets. So if you hear the crickets, I apologize, because they're incredibly loud right now. It sounds like there's one literally sitting outside my door. But moving on. All right. We are going to talk real quick. Like I said, we're not going to talk about speakers too much, because speakers, when you get companies like Celestion, they make speakers that for days. They make all the vintage speakers and different magnets, different wattages, different ohms, different everything. And that is an extremely subjective thing. And when you're like Eddie Van Halen, when he was making his amp, he just simply called up Celestion and said, was it Celestion? I think it's Celestion he's using in his cabs. Simply called him up and said, hey, I need a speaker. This is what I'm looking for. And they will physically just make him a speaker. Well, we don't have that. Unfortunately, we can't do that. So on that note, we're going to do everything except a speaker. Because speaker, that's just something you're just going to have to kind of, for lack of a better term, meander through it and play a bunch of cabs and just see what sounds good to you. So moving on from that, we're going to start real quick with cab woods. Now, you've got a lot of options here, but there's not a lot of options out there, really. If you, starting with really cheap cabs, they're going to be made out of particle board or particle wood. You really don't want to buy anything made out of that, because that is an extremely cheap, dead, heavy wood. Your cab's going to weigh a ton, more than likely. It's going to produce no sound at all, because the sound of particle wood is very, very dead. It doesn't add any kind of tonal characteristics to the speaker or to anything else in your signal chain. The only nice thing about it is if you want to hear what a speaker sounds like, the true tone of a speaker, then it works pretty good, because it doesn't add any coloration to the sound of the speaker. And then there's another one out there called MDF, and it's a compressed wood also, and it is tonally dead. And you'll find a lot of cabs made out of that. Marshall makes some low ring cabs out of that. I think Ignator makes some cabs made out of that. They are out there. So you really don't start getting into really good stuff normally until you get over $800. And at that point, the biggest wood that you're going to find used in higher end cabs is going to be birch. Now, it is plywood birch. pieces of wood pushed together and held with glue. But that doesn't matter because the plywood birch is a very resonant wood. And the nice thing about birch is very even across the tonal range. It has a really good resonant bass. It's got really good mids. It's got good highs. So birch just makes a fantastic cab, and it is by far the most popular out there. If you buy like your standard 1960s Marshall cab, which is amazing, 2 thumbs up, then it's going to be made of birch. And if I'm not mistaken, most of your boogies are going to be out of birch also. And then moving on from birch, then you get into real wood cabs, and this is where the money skyrockets. Now this is where you get a little more of a chance to shape your tone. And the woods work exactly the same as the woods do in a guitar. If you buy a solid mahogany cabinet, it's going to have a very, very boomy low end. It's going to be very resonant on the bottom. And you know, if you end up buying a maple cab, which you can buy maple cabs, then it's going to have more pronounced mids and you know, a little better on the highs. And it works exactly pretty much like the woods do for your guitar. So if you watched the last video, you kind of understanding how woods are. But when you get into full wood cabs, the price goes up tremendously. So most people, like myself, we buy, they're still expensive, but we buy the birch cabs. I mean, hell, a Marshall 1960s cab brand new is what, $1,300? They're not cheap. Now, in my particular Marshall, I'm running 2 G12s and 2 Celestion Vintage 30s because to me, 4 Vintage 30s to me is just a little too harsh, but I like the pronounced mids of a Vintage 30, and then the G12 will kind of smooth that out for me a little bit. So running the 2 separate speakers in my cab works very well for me, and I like that tone on that. But moving on from there, now we're going to talk about tubes, because this is where the tone really starts to come into your amplifier. All right, the first one we're going to start with is the infamous 6L6. We're going to kind of key in on the 6L6 and the EL34s, because when you're going after a particular tone, you're really going to have 2 big sections to draw from: the American rock tone, and we're talking about rock. We're not talking about jazz, blues, and all that. The American rock tone or the British rock tone. And the tube that is just synonymous with the American rock tone is the 6L6. And the tube that is synonymous with the British rock tone is the EL34, which happens to be my favorite. And actually, even on my Kemper, what I have profiled on here is a 5153 EL34. And believe it or not, I did not profile it with the 5153 cab. I actually used my Marshall cab. I thought it sounded better than the EVH cab. So when you're out there buying cabs and heads, remember, just because you're buying an EVH head does not mean you need to buy an EVH cab, because I guarantee you there's a cab out there that's going to sound better to you. One of my all-time favorite cabs, I had a Mesa Boogie 412 straight deep cab, and it had 4 black shadows in it, and it was amazing. It did not matter what amp I put on top of that cab, it sounded phenomenal. Sold that like an idiot. If you've seen my other videos, how much I beat myself up over all the great gear that I've sold over the years that I could just absolutely kill myself for selling. But moving on to tubes and amp heads. Quick side note, Preamp Tubes 12AX7. There are variations of that step down the gain, but for the most part, pretty much any rock amp you buy is going to have 12AX7s in it. And that's where you're going to go. You can't step over to a TU, which will give you a lower amount of gain. I don't know why anybody would want to do that, unless you're maybe playing through like a JBM, which has more gain than you could ever use in a million years. But moving on. All right, we're going to go to the 6L6. The 6L6, like I said, is synonymous with the American rock sound. The 6L6 is very fat, punchy, and strong. The mids are very tight, articulate, and very warm, and it has a very nice top-end chime to it. The 6L6 does not break up easily, but if you crank that amp wide open, A, you're going to be deaf, and B, you're going to get a very nice, warm, tube overdriven sound from overloading the 6L6s, which is nice, but you can't stand the volume unless you're using some kind of attenuator. It'll just blow your head off and probably crumble your house that you're in also. All right, now there are some variations of the 6L6. You have the KT66 and the 5881. These are common substitutes for 6L6s. The KT66 was actually Britain's answer to the 606. And what you can do is you can put a KT66 in place of your 6L6. Dude, that's a lot to say. KT66, 6L6, KT66, 6L6, KT66, 6L6. You can put a KT66. You can put a KT66 in place of a 6L6. There, for the love of God. And what it will do is it will give you a cleaner tone. If you like to drive your amp really hard, this one will not break up as soon as a 6L6, even though a 6L6 is very hard to break up. Now you can use a 5881 in place of a 6L6. And what a 5881 is going to do is it's going to give you less low end frequency response, but it has a much quicker breakup. So you can get more into that tube overdriven sound faster than you can with a 6L6. So case in point, let's say you've got your guitar dialed in, this, that, the other, so on, so on, so on, but you're really having to pull your bass on your head. You're really having to pull it down to get rid of some of the booming on the lows. That's a good time to jerk the 6L6s out and put in the 5881s because, like I said, EQ is to shape, not to give you tone. It is to shape. So you get all that dialed in. Your 6L6s may be too boomy. You drop into 5881s. Next thing you know, now your bass is over here instead of way over here where you really don't want it to be. Because when you pull out bass frequencies, you got to remember it's going to shift the frequency. It's going to shift the tone all the way across the board, and all of a sudden your highs are going to become really thin sounding. So when you balance it out by replacing the tube to the appropriate tube for the sound you're after, I know that's a lot. Then you can get back to shaping your sound with your EQ. Moving on. Heading to the EL34, which happens to be my favorite tube. I do love 6L6s, and I have to admit, there are times when I do wish I was playing a 6L6 depending on the song. But there's just something about those searing mids and highs on the EL34, because I'm a product of the 80s, and I just love that, that raucous, raw 80s guitar tone. I dig it. One of my favorites actually being Mick Mars, believe it or not. When people think of tone, they don't think of Mick Mars. Check out Mick Mars. His tone is amazing. That guy's got some killer tone. He's just got a great rock and roll tone. If I'm not mistaken, he's using 2 amps, splitting off into 2 amps, 2 different sounds to create that tone. Don't hold me to that, but I think that's what's happening. Back to the EL34s. The EL34 is the British Sound high-gain Marshall amps. Marshall switched to the EL34s in the late 60s from the KT66. The EL34 has low-end frequency response that is a lot leaner than a 6L6. It has very tight mids and crisp highs. The EL34 is easily overdriven, and it provides a much softer crunch distortion than a 6L6 does. 2 common replacement tubes for the EL34 are the 6CA7 and the KT77. The 6CA7 is actually the American replacement, the American version of the EL34. If you put a 6CA7 in place of an EL34, you'll get a more pronounced low-end frequency, and you'll actually get a little more headroom. The other common replacement is the KT77. These two tubes, being the EL34 and the KT77, they sound very, very similar. The nice thing about the KT77 is it actually has a different design than the EL34. You can actually take the KT77 and in certain American amps, you can replace the 6L6 for it, and it'll actually take your American head with your American wiring schematics and give it more of a British flavor. Pretty cool. I bet you didn't know you could do all these cool, badass things with tubes, because most people don't. They buy the head they use, that's the head they got, boom, they're done. A lot of ways you can shape your tone. Moving on from there, we got the EL84. Not my favorite tube, I gotta admit, and it's actually kind of a cheap tube. This tube is, again, synonymous with the Vox sound. Although Vox makes a great amp, and there's obviously a place in this world for it. Look at Brian May, look at the Beatles. Can't argue the point. It's not my tone. So therefore, I'm not a big fan of the EL84, although it is the EL84 that is in the classic PV amplifier. which for blues and clean stuff is actually a brilliant freaking amp. It sounds fantastic with the EL84s in it. When you move over to the Hughes and Kettners, to give you an example, the Hughes and Kettner Tube Meisters. I love Hughes and Kettner. I love their products. I'm not a fan of the Tube Meister series. They run the EL84s, and I just think it's just too harsh of a sound. You can't get the smoothness out of it. And some of it has to do with the way they've wired it, and I'm assuming it's the diodes they're using, because it has that sizzle on top of the high gain, which I'm really not a fan of. Crank had it in the Crankenstein amps. And I know Dimebag Darrell's an amazing guitar player. He's heralded, he's the man. There's no denying it. But I was not a big fan of Dimebag's tone, even though he did have his tone, and a lot of people love that tone. I know a lot of people who love that sizzle on top. I just happen not to like that sizzle on top. It's my dog. He's obviously got a niche. Hey, bro. Dude. Come here. Come here. Come here. This is my dog. Come here. This is Wookie. This is my Great Dane. So any extraneous noise that you hear floating around in my videos, it's this guy right here. All right. So moving on from there. Lay down. There you go. Good boy. Good boy. Back to the EL84. Really, dude? Back to the EL84s, like I said, that is synonymous with the British sound of the British sound, with the Vox sound. The thing about the EL84 is that it has a very clear focus, and it's a very bright and trebly sounding tube. Moving on from the EL84, not a lot to say about the EL84. It kind of is what it is. It's just kind of that tube that sits out there. Moving on from the EL84, we got the 6550. Now, the 6550, you can find that in some amps. This actually kind of became a popular tube in bass amps. The 6550 is an extremely clean, resonant tube. Has a tremendous amount of headroom on it, so it doesn't really have a very good breakup stage in it. So in the favor of American amps, a lot of American amps, some did use it, but most of them did go the 606 side for the breakup properties and just the overall tonal values of that tube itself. Now, Marshall did use the 6550 for a while, and actually they sitting out for several years in the JMPs. And the JMPs, I gotta admit, JMP is kind of one of those things I have a love-hate relationship with. I've heard some that I think are just absolutely brilliant. I've heard others that I think just sound terrible. But honestly, that's how all these iconic guys that have these iconic sounds, that's how they found their iconic sounds. They actually ended up buying an amp that wasn't normal. There was something wrong with that particular amp. Something didn't get wired right, or something just was, had one too many diodes or pentos or triodes or something that gave just a little bit of a different flavor on that amp. They got lucky, came across that amp, played it, and was like, holy shit, there's the sound. And then, of course, that amp dies, and they spend the rest of their life trying to recreate that amp. So the 6550s really did not make it into a lot of amps, but it was a very good bass tube amp, if there's any bass players watching this, by the way. There is a replacement for the 6550, and this is the KT88. Both these tubes are very clean, and they sound very similar. They have a very bold, tight tone to both these tubes. They do have a lot of headroom. It takes a lot of power to break them up. When they do break up, they actually have a very nice distortion when you can get them to break up. But then again, like I said, you've lost your house, the cops are coming over, the neighbors are complaining, and you killed your dog. So that's not what you want to do. So that kind of wraps up the section on tubes. I hope that kind of helps you a little bit understand tone a little more. When most people think tone, like I said in the video on guitars, they just get a guitar and an amp and they dial, boom, okay, there's my tone. But there's so much more to chasing tone than that, and that's why you're chasing tone. Hell, if all you had to do is buy a guitar and an amp, nobody'd be chasing tone. You would literally just go get a guitar and an amp, boom, you'd have perfect tone. And don't get me wrong, you can go buy a guitar and an amp and get extremely good tone, but we're talking about the tone you hear in your head. If you've got something specific you're going after, start with the guitar, the type of wood, the type of neck. Move to the pickups. From the pickups, move down the signal chain to the head. American, British, blah, 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 blah. You get the idea. Once you get that, you can actually take your tubes to adjust basically the EQ curves of your amp. How resonant, how present your amps are. You can adjust all that with your tubes. Then when you get the right cab made out of the right wood, more than likely it's going to be birch, which is a good wood because it's very even tonally. It's a very good wood. Then if you get all that worked out and it's working great, but you're just missing that one little thing, you don't know what it is, that's when you get into the speakers. And that's where the work comes in, because there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of speakers. Because every speaker manufacturer, Celestion and Eminence and blah, 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 they all make recreations of all the speakers that throughout all the years. You know, you have greenbacks and creambacks and bluebacks. You know, you got vintage 30s. You got different types of magnets, like I said earlier. You got different wattages, different ohmage. And it's on and on. So that combination of trying to find that correct speaker could literally take you a lifetime. By the time you buy a speaker, plug it in, pull it out. Buy a speaker, plug it in, pull it out. That would take forever. So hopefully with these few tips that I've given you about tone, this will help you shape your tone a little faster. And you may not get it 100% perfect, but I promise you if you do all these things, you'll get a damn 95. And 95% is pretty good tone. Because I guarantee you, 95% of the people were only 75% happy with their tone. So if you get up to 90-95%, you young men have fantastic tone at that point. So I hope you liked the video. If you have any comments, put it down in the comments section. If you have any questions, put it down in the comments section. I actually got it right that time, dude. Please subscribe to the channel. If there's anything you need to know, and if there's anything that you feel that I left out about tone, please, by all means, let me know, because I'm always looking for more information. Because I think I'm a pretty smart guy, but damn it, I don't know it all. And, you know, that's my goal. I want to know it all. I'm working diligently to knowing it all on everything. So, once again, please subscribe to the channel. If you have any comments, put it in the comment section. If you have any questions, put it in the questions section. I'm going to sit here in the world's ugliest shirt for the rest of the night. Make me a little bit of dinner, have me a couple of drinks, maybe, possibly. I don't know. Just have to see how I feel. But until then, work on that tone. Get that sound right. If you get something that sounds amazing, by all means, let me know, because I am always looking for the next greatest thing. Get your sound right. Play hard. Until next time, rock hard.